The genre of still life is perhaps one of the oldest and most classical genres of art. Representing everyday objects can be a poetic and strategic choice in terms of creating an artwork, and in the case of the still life genre, we find that there are many arrangements of various objects can carry a lot of weight and meaning. But then on the other hand, learning how to represent simple three-dimensional household items can be a really good drawing exercise to enhance your understanding of light and shadow and how to achieve these concepts through the process of an artwork. With that being said, in today's video we will be learning how to draw a still life using some drawing tools and going through a simple set of steps to help us understand some fundamental concepts that can be used to represent objects in a realistic way. With that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org where we explore various art related topics, and in today's video we will be learning how to draw a still life. So with that being said, let's get started. Now we're going to be using a simple set of tools. In this case we will be using a sketching pencil. Maybe a blue pencil is preferable in this case, and we'll be using an arrangement of graphite pencils from harder to softer pencils, giving us a variety of tonal values to work with, and then working with a darker medium like pen that works really well in tandem with pencil. Now the first thing we want to understand conceptually is the arrangement and the choice of objects for our still life drawing, and this is where we get to have a little bit of fun in terms of setting up the space that we are drawing our three-dimensional structures or objects of our choice within. Now still life drawing requires some good research and preparation. In many ways it is a good way to kind of scour the internet for inspiration, looking at examples that inspire you beforehand to understand some compositional ideas. So choosing items is basically the starting point. We want to start by choosing a few items we think are interesting and might work well together in a single artwork. So the idea is to make sure you choose your items strategically and also consider maybe thinking about items with different textural qualities, but from there we're going to move on to arranging the scene. So once we have our items, we want to basically work on arranging our items within a space. So trying to find a good balance between all the objects. A good suggestion is to always consider using something like fabric as a set which the objects can be placed on. So try to think of different angles from which you will be drawing your still life, and that plays a major role. And then lastly and most importantly is the concept of lighting. So we do want to think about lighting. This is an opportunity to also create a really vividly contrasted or subtle lit scene. So you can also look around your home with lamps, see what kind of lamps you can use, play around with having a light more to one direction, but then maybe take some photos, take a few different photos of various scenes set out with your objects of choice, with your lighting set up differently, your scene set up differently, play around with composition. But from there, once you have made an actual decision, we're going to move on to the drawing process. So once you have selected your items and you have arranged them in a space to your satisfaction, we can now move on to the drawing process. So as we go through the basic steps of drawing a still life, we will learn that there are always going to be subtle differences in the end result and the objects that are actually being drawn, which is okay. The idea is that we are representing structures, and this is where again we want to kind of look for source inspiration depending on the medium you're using, but in this case we'll be going through a simple drawing exercise to develop our sense of shadow, light and three-dimensionality. But once we have obviously selected our arrangements and have set up our space, the next thing we want to consider is seating and setup for observation. Now, it is essential that we set up our space to sit and observe the items, and that space remains the same throughout the entire drawing process. So once we have done that, we're going to start by actually lightly sketching the scene. So we want to take our time by sketching out the scene very lightly. It is very important to keep the sketch as light as possible in this early stage. And the intention here is that we're trying to place the objects in their most vague and fundamental shapes. So using a sketching pencil or maybe a light graphite pencil, like a blue sketching pencil, we do want to basically work through just a very light sketch of the scene. Now, this is the most important part of a still life actually, because basically we are drawing from life, which means we are more likely to make mistakes. So it is really essential for us to kind of retain the viewpoints of our drawing. So our seating must stay the same. And in this early stage, take your time to lightly sketch out the scene so you can obviously work over those light sketching marks much easier as we integrate darker shading. A good suggestion is to start with the objects in the foreground, which become a reference for scale and positioning once completed. So using the object that stands in the foreground as a point of reference also help you to sketch and align the surrounding objects more accurately. Again, the more complex the items you use, the more time you should spend working out the placement of different features. For instance, if you use something like a camera or something complex and mechanical, you want to consider how large the buttons are in relation to the lens and all those finer details, or does the camera have a diagonal slant from your viewpoint? All these subtle kinds of perspective questions and detail questions are things you want to be asking yourself. So you want to be asking yourself comprehensive questions, and this is a great way to work through a lightly sketched still life drawing and taking your time developing these fundamental placements of these various objects in your drawing. So objects for still lifes can be difficult when drawing from life, which is why we really just want to spend some time. And if you get tired, remember, a drawing should be something that you spend time on, especially if you're trying to achieve a realistic representation of your subject matter. So take a break if need be and come back to your drawing feeling more refreshed. Now, the intention is to make sure that you're definitely spending a large portion of time on that light sketch, because this is going to set up the demarcations or the areas in which you can develop a proportionally accurate set of objects. And that's the intention behind this early light sketch, is to kind of understand placement, scale, and how these objects actually work collectively in a single scene. Now, once we have done that, what we're going to do is we're going to start actually integrating some shading, but we'll find that we will inevitably want to work from the foreground into the background. And this is because what we do then is we emphasize the foreground with a set of tonal values that define how light or how dark the rest of the surrounding objects should be. So once you have established the scene for the still life, you want to start with the objects in the foreground. You can use whatever medium you would like to shade in your still life drawing, but you want to make sure you work from the foreground to the background. We really want to have established all the elements in a light sketch. This will make the shading process much more seamless. So we want to work through items one at a time, which is a really good idea, and this way you can spend a good portion of time on a single object within your drawing. And as we continue making sure we start with objects in the foreground, we can slowly then utilize that as not only a scale for helping us understand the placement and the size of other objects, but again, understanding the tonal variations and how they compare to one another within our drawing. So another thing we want to think about, once again, is considering the light source, as this is an essential for the shading process, and this will help you to be more intentional with your drawing marks and shading. So you will notice that different items, once again, will always have different interactions with light. And again, this is a really important point I'm trying to drive home here, is that when you start with objects in the foreground, from the early sketch all the way to this point of shading, the idea is that the foreground object is going to help you in the early sketch establish scale and positioning. And by nature of that, it has this kind of continuous puzzle effect, in the sense that once you've established the size of that actual object, you can then understand how the other objects are in relation to that drawn object in the foreground. The same with tonal value in your shading process. Now you're going to set up obviously this particular object in a tonal value, and then kind of use that to define how dark or how light surrounding objects should be, especially depending on their actual textural qualities. Now, working on a single foreground object will also help you to define the tone of the scene and how dark and light objects can be drawn in relation to that foreground object. In many ways, you can also lightly shade the entire still life and slowly add in darker shading, but this method allows you to move through each item one at a time, which again takes off the pressure for you, and you can just focus on drawing individual items. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is how to kind of integrate shading to the surrounding objects, and this method also works as a tonal measuring tool once again. So just as the foreground sketch helps with the scale and position of the surrounding items, having a single item completely drawn can help to navigate how light and dark surrounding items should be. So once you have the foreground item established, you want to start working from one side of the drawing and move through each item. Again, this will help you to work out how dark or how light objects should be in relation to the foreground object. and that will kind of assist you with your current object that you are currently drawing as you refer to your actual real still life set of objects. So as you move through each item, it is important that the first drawn item helps to establish the tonal range for the next, and this process will continue for each item with the succeeding item that follows you, which will have a reference for how dark or how light it should be in terms of its tonal values. Once again, you can also play around with various shading methods in terms of effectively achieving certain textural qualities. In this particular arrangement of materials, we can see we're dealing with metallic surfaces and porcelain surfaces and glass, as well as some actual plant life. So by nature of that, we have a variety of different surfaces, and they're interacting with the light source in different ways, including the fabric upon which all these objects are placed. And again, noticing those various surface differences and the textural differences within those various surfaces can be something to think about in terms of which type of shading method you can use to emphasize those qualities. So make sure you also notice the differences in the surfaces and how they reflect and distort light on their surfaces. We'll find that some objects naturally, once again, like matte-like surfaces, will always have more subtle light reflections. We'll also find that we are starting to sketch surrounding items which might encounter more intricate overlapping features between the surrounding objects. So we can be cautious with shading parts of an object and then focus on the overlapping features or how those particular objects are placed in front of one another in terms of how to represent those qualities with our shading process. So that's something to kind of be mindful of. Now, this is why still life object drawing is really good for observational skills, because it requires you to be attentive to subtle moments like overlapping. And this is also particularly true for objects with strange surfaces that do have the ability to distort and change the environment around them. As you work on objects one at a time, you can also make more attentive observation to the details that are actually present in each object. So, for instance, if we were to work with glass, we would find that the glass is capable of distorting anything that sits around or behind it, which creates these very unique shapes and patterns on the glass. Instead of trying to draw what we think in terms of something like a glass reflecting the environment around us, what we'll see is that in the actual physical representation of those reflections, it's simply just a distortion or a set of patterns, and that's what we want to draw. We don't want to draw what we think the glass is doing, but what we actually see on the surface of the glass. So instead of trying to draw what we think, we look at each item individually and actually see what details are actually visible. As we move through each item one at a time, we will also find that naturally the scene starts to fall into place. So almost as if you were assembling a puzzle once again. And this is particularly true for tonal values and this shading process and how you shade in the next object. As you move on from the previous one, you'll start to see that the previous object again works as a tonal reference for how dark or light the shading should be for the next object. It is really important to take your time and be patient with the drawing process. You do want to make sure that you give the objects for your still life drawing unhindered attention, spending a good portion of time on each item that needs to be drawn. The more attention you give to each object, the more likely you are to effectively assemble objects through the shading process in an effective way. But again, to be conscious of light and how that affects the objects and the surfaces, and then how to strategically use an effective shading method to represent those surfaces is where you want to be mentally during this shading process. Now, there are a few concepts to consider just as you slowly start to work through your still life. Again, from this point onward, it is simply a matter of working on one item at a time. Once you have developed your sketch, you obviously have worked out the scale, position, and lighting. From there, you can kind of slowly work your way through the shading process, working on one item at a time, being conscious of the light source and how shadows are represented, and then thinking about the method of shading to accurately represent those textural differences. But as you continue this, I want to just break down some concepts to consider. This beginner still life drawing tutorial does establish the basic drawing processes for setting up and effectively drawing a still life. However, there are some key concepts to consider that are unique to the still life drawing. Once again, shading styles. So firstly, always think about the medium and shading style you'd like to incorporate. And this is particularly necessary for deciding what type of outcome you are aiming for, as pens can have high contrast and sharp lines, whereas pencils can be used to kind of achieve more smooth and subtle gradients. And then the other thing are the surfaces. This is another concept that we really want to like drill into our heads. Explore both organic and mechanical made objects for more enriched and interesting drawing subject matter. So don't necessarily just draw a bunch of plants or simply a bunch of bowls, or try to have diversity in your choice of objects, and by nature of that you'll become more aware of the different surface areas that you have an opportunity to play with. So textures are always different between organic and man-made objects, but textures can also be different between various man-made objects, and that's just something you want to think about. And then lastly, it is really important to know when to stop. We can easily overshade and especially in a drawing, oversaturate the drawing by carrying on. In many ways, what makes a still life beautiful is the balance of tonal values, placements among items. So knowing when to stop is really essential. But otherwise, guys, that is the basic fundamental process of how to approach a still life. I hope this video was helpful. Again, consider your arrangements, work on an object one at a time. The early sketch is also really important. Another thing, make sure to use items as references for other items in terms of tonal value, position, and scale. And lastly, just be patient. But otherwise, guys, thanks again. And if you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below. If you are interested in similar or related topics, we do love to hear feedback from you, and we are interested in exploring what you guys are interested in seeing. But also, please do show some love by liking and subscribing. That helps us to grow the channel, which ultimately enables us to make more art-related content for you guys, which we love to do. But thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, cheers.